The UK and the US have hailed their trade deal as historic. The British Prime Minister Keir Starmer was the first world leader to strike an agreement on trade with President Trump following his sweeping tariffs. But how significant is it? Will the deal be enough to protect the UK economy? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, it was billed by Donald Trump as a major trade deal, but one prominent US economist has said it isn't worth the paper it's written on. So, will this be a lasting deal, and who's really benefiting?
It's really good to have got this deal over the line.
With the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer on speakerphone, the US and UK reached a breakthrough trade deal. The agreement comes after Trump's barrage of global tariffs intended to put America first.
With this deal, the UK joins the United States in affirming that reciprocity and fairness is an essential and vital principle of international trade.
While the deal leaves intact the 10% tariff on most UK goods entering the US, it provides relief to some industries. Specifically, the 25% tariff imposed on UK steel and aluminium has been scrapped, while the UK's car industry will see US tariffs slashed from 27.5% to 10%. On the US side, it will benefit from the UK removing both its 20% tariff on US beef exports and its 19% tariff on US ethanol. The White House says the deal will create a $5 billion worth opportunity for new US agricultural exports.
We've agreed the basis of a historic economic prosperity deal, and that is a deal that will protect British businesses and save thousands of jobs in Britain. Really important, skilled, well-paid jobs.
According to economists, the agreement is expected to save the UK $8.7 billion in projected losses from Trump's tariffs. But critics argue the government should have pushed for more trade concessions. So is it the US or UK that is really benefiting from this trade deal?
Well, let's meet our guests here in the studio with me. I'm delighted to say we have Adam Boulton. He is a political journalist and broadcaster. And we have Ian King, the renowned business journalist. Joining us from Coventry in the UK, we have Allie Renison. She's a former advisor to the UK government and associate director at SEC Newgate. And in Brighton, we have Emily Lydgate. She is co-director of the UK Trade Policy Observatory. You're all very welcome to Roundtable. Emily, to you first. So the UK has got in first. Does that matter, being first? What was behind the thinking here?
I mean, I think even some of the key players were taken by surprise about how quickly this deal emerged. And I can't say I know exactly what went on behind the scenes, but what I can say is that there are probably pros and cons to this. For the UK, I think that businesses are now left wondering what the timeline of this is going to be. It doesn't seem like there was a lot of detailed preparatory work that took place, and so there's still a lot of uncertainty, and that's creating some frustration. When will we have the details of the tariff reductions, and when will those be, all the other elements be pinned down? I think what's really interesting about being first is that we're starting to get a sense of what these deals that result in tariff concessions with the Trump administration look like. And I think we'll probably get into some more of the details of that in our discussion.
Ali, this all seemed to happen at breakneck speed, didn't it? I mean, so many UK governments wanted a deal with the Americans. They didn't get anywhere. At one point, they were told they would be at the back of the queue. And Keir Starmer pulls this rabbit out of a hat one morning.
Yeah, I mean, I think the speed with which we know that the two sides had been negotiating, but I think the speed at which the US decided it wanted to announce something, because it's not obviously a trade deal that it announced, it's an outline framework with a couple of headline commitments for now. I think that took the UK by surprise a little bit. I think that the White House has been under increasing pressure from members of the Republican Party in Congress to show that it was doing a deal. And I think the UK is one of the easiest sort of sides to sort of say that it's doing some kind of interim arrangement with while they carry on negotiating.
Ian, to you, that's a very good point, isn't it? That it's not actually a trade deal. It's kind of like a limited pact.
Yeah, that's the main disappointment with it. Ali's absolutely right, by the way. It's not just the Republican Party, it was also the financial markets. If you look at what happened to US equities and the dollar post-Liberation Day, as Trump styles it, he was under a lot of pressure from investors as well. He had to settle nerves to an extent. But yeah, this isn't a full-blown trade agreement. This is not the trade agreement that the UK government that successive UK governments have sought with the United States post-Brexit. It's just a trade deal. It was all really essentially about mitigating the damage done by Liberation Day. If you take, for example, the fact that prior to Liberation Day, the UK blended tariff, the blended tariff on UK exports to the US was about 2%. It went up to 13% post-Liberation Day. Well, it's still at around 11.1, 11.2%. So this is all about mitigating damage. It's not really that big a greater deal for the United Kingdom.
Adam, Keir Starmer used the phrase, job saved, not job done. That's what this is about, isn't it?
Yeah, and we should bear in mind that the agreement actually says it's not legally binding, so it could still change. I think politically this was very important, actually, for both of them. Trump clearly is rethinking the tariffs that he announced up to and including on Liberation Day. I think he's changed more than 50 of the things that he said. He needed, if you like, to climb down, but it helped him politically to do it with someone who wasn't going to say, ha ha, you're climbing down, but was going to say, thank you very much, you're a great deal maker. And so that was the special relationship happening, if you like, at a political level. Also, there are immediate pressing questions, as Ian's mentioned, for British workers. So Starmer was able to actually appear talking to Trump about the deal in front of workers at Jaguar who would probably have lost their job had this come into force, the tariffs come into force at the rate that they were promised. So that meant that, it was a political achievement to be first in the queue, but it meant that, when he was mocked in Prime Minister's questions by the opposition leader, Kemi Badenoch, who said, your tiny trade deal, he was able to say, well, tell that to the people working in the car factories, tell that to the people working in the steel works, whose jobs he will claim he saved by that deal. That said, of course, Britain is not better off than it was before Trump came along, but it is also, and again, I think this is quite crucial, managed to package the American deal with a so-called deal with India and with negotiations with the EU. And one of the important things that came out of the deal for Britain was a negative, which is that what they agreed with America does not obstruct what they agree with the Europeans. So that, again, politically was quite significant. But it's not economically a big gain. It's just making it slightly less bad than it might have been.
Thanks, Adam. Emily, to you, Keir Starmer is treading a very difficult path here, isn't he? He's got Europe, European Union, China and the United States trying to do deals everywhere and keep all of these huge trading blocs happy.
Yes, it's a very difficult line to walk. I would say with respect to the UK-EU dynamic, you can see how actively the UK is trying to play both sides of the fence. It's got tons of flights going to DC and tons of trains going to Brussels simultaneously. And I think you can see that there are signs that even though the UK has done this deal with the US, it was trying to preserve its ability to strike a reset, as they're calling it, with the EU, particularly in the area of food standards, where it pushed back on some of the US's demands. But Brussels is probably not going to greet this agreement with a particular enthusiasm, not only because of specific market access issues like ethanol, but also because the UK has effectively undermined the WTO system with this deal, and that sets a bad precedent for others. So I think that the EU will be watching carefully to see what the UK might be willing to agree with the US in the future.
And Ali, I think people in China will be watching very carefully as well, won't they? Because they seem to be quite upset about one clause in this deal about steel and aluminium products from third countries being used in supply chains. The Chinese reckon this is aimed very directly at them.
Yeah, there's actually more explicit references, although without mentioning China by name, they talk about kind of, in the field of, quote, economic security relations with what they call non-market economies, which is obviously code for China. And it's, this is actually consolidating a precedent that we've seen before, not even just under Trump, under President Biden, when we agreed with the US to lift after Brexit, the earlier Trump tariffs on steel. There was a condition that was put in that said, pretty much aimed at British Steel, which is currently owned, although it's been taken into public ownership for now by the UK government, by a sort of Chinese company. That clause back then, under Biden, said that there needed to be an audit that was performed every year, and the US could access it, making sure there was no kind of undue influence from the Chinese Communist Party in the steel companies in the UK. So this is just, I think, the latest in kind of a push from Washington to try and use its engagement with third countries on trade to sort of move China out of the way.
Ian, is there a danger here for the UK that it gets caught in the crossfire, if you like, between China and a trade war with the United States, and that Britain pays a very heavy price for this particular deal?
Undoubtedly, there is a risk there. Allie's absolutely right, by the way. And let's not forget, there is a precedent for this. In Trump 1.0, at the behest of the Trump administration, the UK effectively kicked out Huawei, the telecoms equipment supplier, from its 5G build-out. That has set back the UK telecoms infrastructure sector by many, many years, because all of the telcos, the likes of BT, they had to rip Huawei kit out of their systems and start all over again before they could even think about rolling out 5G. So that had a big cost, and that was done directly at the behest of the Trump administration. That was when Theresa May was in number 10. So that causes all sorts of ill will. I mean, Huawei were a huge employer here in the UK. They hoped to make it their bridgehead for Europe. And Angela Merkel at the time, who was then German Chancellor, drove a rather tougher bargain over Huawei with the United States. She was rather more reluctant to toe the US line. So, yeah, that's the sort of tightrope that the UK government is walking. On the other side of that, there is a danger for the UK with products like steel. If Trump has shut the doors to Chinese produce entering the United States, which he effectively has with the tariffs that he's imposed, there is a danger that the Chinese will dump a lot of that on markets like the UK, and that would obviously put even more pressure on domestic producers like British Steel, so Starmer may not see that as being a hill he wants to die on.
And just on that point, Adam, how do you think Starmer is doing then? Because every prime minister who comes into power in this country wants growth, and it's very difficult to deliver.
Well, it is indeed, and there's a lot of argument about the direction in which the UK economy is heading. That said, I think that it is true, as has already been said, that the UK has sort of broken out of the WTO system. But the point is that Trump has smashed the WTO system, however we end up. So we are going to have to deal with an era where, countries are like the UK with the EU are breaking away from trade blocs, and where individual countries such as the US are unilaterally giving up trade agreements. Now the UK, having taken back control, has no alternative but to try and balance China, the EU and America, and to do it in a way which doesn't antagonize, one or the other. The clause that the Chinese have picked up on about steel and is actually linked to security. Now, there's going to be a question as to how both Europe and the United States, what security posture they take going forward, towards China, for example. And, it wasn't just the Americans who wanted Huawei out. It was the heads of MI6, MI5, and CCHQ. All the intelligence sector said, you cannot do this. You're opening yourself up too much. And a lot of Europeans shared that as well. It is going to be difficult, but, if you say how well is Starmer doing it, I think he is alert to the various difficulties which are going on. And I think on balance, the UK realises that the United States has become less reliable. Correspondingly, it's trying to build up reliable relationships with the European Union. And China is kind of in a balance. They know China's not going to be an ally, but there is something that they have to take account of, as you say, in pursuit of growth.
Ian, you're in the city in London every single day talking to senior leaders, CEOs. What's the vibe from them about Starmer and this deal?
Well, I think they would go along with what I said previously, which is that this was all about damage limitation rather than striking out and getting some fantastic trade deal with the US. So that's the bigger prize. It's getting a fully fledged trade agreement. Starmer has one thing that a lot of people have been quite impressed by that Starmer pulled off by was he managed to keep in place the digital services tax, which is paid for by all of the US tech giants. And there were a lot of fears that he might sacrifice that. And that is something, particularly if you look at swathes of the retail sector, swathes of the media who've lost a lot of business, the advertising sector, all of these people have been affected directly by competition from the likes of Amazon and Google and so on. And I think there was some relief that that didn't get sacrificed in this.
Emily, to you, there's not much mention of Pharma, and that's a big, big earner for the UK. There's a lot of trade between the two countries, but the pharmaceutical industry, very scant on detail as to where they sit with this deal.
Yes, I think that the waters have become, if anything, muddier as well since this was announced, and Trump has said that he's going to crack down on drug pricing in the US because drug pricing has been a very live negotiating issue between the UK and the US in the past. So we don't know how this is going to play into whatever is discussed between the UK and the US, and also we don't really know for sure whether the US will follow through in not applying its threatened national security Section 232 tariffs on the pharmaceutical industry. So I would say it is economically important, but certainly for more questions than answers here.
Ali, just on that point about big pharma, second biggest sector for the UK going into the United States, £6.6 billion generated last year for UK companies. How are they feeling not having the knowledge, not knowing what they're going to do or where this deal leaves them? I mean, business likes and loves security, doesn't it? And knowing what's going to happen.
I think on the one hand, so there's concern about, we know that there is a coming, as Emily mentioned, sort of Section 232 national security investigation being done on areas and product lines, including for sort of pharmaceuticals. Big question about whether that is just finished products, but also kind of inputs into kind of pharmaceutical, medical products. On the other hand, if you look at what was mentioned in the outline framework, it does hint at kind of maybe some reciprocal preferential treatment in respect of shared national security priorities and those future 232 investigations. So definitely some uncertainty, but perhaps some kind of faint hope that because of this outline framework, that the UK will have a sort of more preferential approach when it comes to how the US deals with its pharmaceutical investigations and subsequent tariffs going forward.
Ian, when you read the deal first off, what was your initial assessment? Because when I read the headlines of it, it struck me that the Americans were getting a very good deal and Britain was still living with 10% tariffs that weren't there previously.
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely right. And there are certain sectors that in the UK that have come off quite badly. The bioethanol sector, for example. Now, whilst the UK has maintained red lights on things like food quality, hormone-treated beef and so forth, there are still nonetheless chinks in the armour there. There is still some American food produce that is going to get in at some point, and that is a cause of concern. And largely the fact is that a lot of this stuff has not really been fleshed out. It hasn't even been properly documented. Big concern there. The Pharma issue, by the way, is massive, and I fear that is not going to go away. The Trump administration figures they're talking very loudly about the fact that Americans pay 4 times what Brits do for their branded medicines. And I think there's a real misunderstanding in the US about why that is the case. No one seems to have figured it through. One of the factors behind that is the sort of quirks of the US healthcare system and the way that medicines are bought and paid for, largely by middlemen. But in the UK, of course, The buyer of last resort for the vast majority of branded medicines is the National Health Service, which has colossal buying power on a scale that none of the US healthcare providers have. And accordingly, they can drive a very, very hard bargain with Big Pharma. It's something, by the way, that Big Pharma has been quite ticked off about as well increasingly in recent years.
Adam, I know you're a vegetarian. However, a lot of people in the UK, they don't want to eat American beef and they don't want chlorinated chicken from the United States. Are we likely to see these products on our shelves?
Well, they're told they're not going to. And this is where there's a sort of philosophical confusion, if you like, in the administration, because, what Donald Trump actually said was that the man he called Bobby Kennedy, his health secretary, was actually moving American food standards towards British and European food standards.
Increasing them, driving standards up.
Driving standards, towards British standards, which was interesting. Similarly on Pharma, Bobby Kennedy is not a fan of Big Pharma and has been complaining about the high prices that they have been imposing. So rhetorically, they are, philosophically in a very different position. And really, what they're talking about wanting to use tariffs to deliver is to onshore manufacturing. That's effectively what they're talking about. So that, a lot of the pharma that we're citing the statistics on are actually American-owned multinationals that are choosing to produce outside of the United States. And, similarly, we haven't raised yet the supposed 100% tax on American films made abroad. Now, that could have an absolutely disastrous impact on British movies, Canadian movies, places where... but if it did have a disastrous impact on those, it would hit the bottom line of American movie exporters. So, a lot of this is saying, I want Hollywood to really start thinking about working at home. And over a sustained number of years, people are going to think again about, do we have to do this abroad? And that... will affect our workers, if you like, if those jobs go back to the United States. But in the meantime, the economics of what's being threatened simply doesn't make sense from the American point of view.
Emily, to you, do you think other countries will be looking at what the UK has achieved here and thinking we can do a bit better, maybe?
I think other countries will absolutely be looking at this deal with interest. And it's hard to say. I would guess that certain elements of it, the Trump administration will try to replicate in other deals. So I think some of the national security conditionality for being exempted from reciprocal tariffs and from Section 232, these national security tariffs, are likely to be something that might be built into these agreements. But it could be that the UK has been viewed relatively favorably by the Trump administration, not necessarily because of the special relationship, but just because their trade relationship is fairly equal. There's not a huge trade deficit. So it could be that for that reason, the UK was able to engage a bit more constructively than some other countries may be able to. In other words, it was able to have more reciprocity in its agreement. But I think the tricky thing is, the problem for the UK and other countries is that Trump has pretty explicitly set out that he sees his trade policy as a zero-sum game. In other words, the US is leveraging its economic importance to get stuff from other countries. So how do you square that, if you look at the announcement of the deal, Trump was talking about how it was a great deal for the US, but they still maintain their 10% tariff wall and all the tariff revenue from the UK, whereas Starmer was talking about, VE Day and reciprocity and mutual assistance. So I think there's a kind of it's not that all trade agreements benefit, everyone. There will be sectors that lose from and jobs that lose from increased foreign competition pursuant to a trade agreement, but there are other sectors which benefit because they have more export opportunities. So it's not that everyone benefits, but usually there's at least a presumption of that there will be mutual benefits and growth. So I think it's a very tricky type of negotiation to enter into. And in that context, I think the UK has done relatively well.
Thanks, Emily. Ian, how long do you give this trade deal? Does it last? Is this something that can be improved upon? It's a work in progress, or if Trump changes his mind overnight, toys out the pram?
Well, you put your finger on a very key concern that a lot of people would have there. He is capable of changing his mind and shooting from the hip, as Adam just mentioned with the film thing. I mean, the ink wasn't even dry on this trade deal when he starts talking about hitting film production. I mean, the bigger concern for me from the UK is that he seems peculiarly fixated on manufacturing and on the trade in goods. And as Emily said, the UK and the US are broadly in balance on goods trade. If he turns his attention to services, well, then we're in real trouble because there's a massive trade imbalance there. The UK runs a huge trade surplus with the US when it comes to the services sector, and that obviously makes up the vast majority of UK GDP these days. Manufacturing is only about 10% of UK GDP. We make our money by selling services to the world, and if Trump decides that he's going to hit those, then we really are in a spot of bother.
On that note, we will say thank you. The clock has beaten us. Ian, Adam, Ellie and Emily, thank you all so much. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.